Zombies are still pretty popular, and there is something that kind of bugs me about many zombie movies and video games, namely how fragile the zombies seem to be. I mean, they're undead, so they should be pretty hard to kill, right? And it's generally the go for the brain kind of thing. But once you do, and once you do damage any part of the brain, pretty much, be it with just a needle poking in there or whatever you have, that just drops them instantly, as if struck by Zeus's thunderbolt. It's a bit strange, especially considering that there have been some regular living human beings who have survived quite grievous injuries to their head and quite a lot of brain damage. For instance, very famous example, Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker in the 19th century, and there was an accidental discharge of powder, and the explosion actually drove a pretty large heavy iron rod through his brain. And he survived, surprisingly enough, even though that thing was pretty hefty. It was a 6-kilo iron rod, massive. Yeah, that's 13 pounds for you metric illiterates. And he did have some permanent effects from it. Since the rod went through the frontal part of his brain, the frontal lobe, he had some serious personality changes, and he became somewhat socially inept. The problem is that, among other things, the frontal lobe is responsible for judgment, so it kind of seemed as if he wasn't really thinking before doing something, and his moral compass went kind of down the hill. Although those personality changes got better over time as his brain started to adapt to its damage and other areas took over the earlier functions, and he started to relearn, social behavior and such. But yeah, it goes to show that even if you have substantial brain damage, like a massive metal rod through your brain, you can still survive it, even as a regular human being. And in case of a zombie, they don't need most of what is in the frontal part of the brain. The frontal lobe, yeah, it's mostly comprehension, creative thought, problem solving. That's not really what zombies are well known for. It's also responsible for coordinated movement, so that may make them, I don't know, even more sluggish than they already are, unless that's exactly the reason why they move so weirdly, that they simply don't use all of that. So if you see something like in Walking Dead, where they jab a knife right through the forehead, like a puny folding knife through the forehead, yeah, that's kind of a feat, because that is the strongest part of the skull that is very difficult to get through. But somehow they manage, and that just drops them. But unfortunately, if you just get through here with a short blade, that's not going to do much. It's only going to damage the frontal lobe, which they don't need anyway, apparently. So that's kind of strange. And just as a side note, the how fragile the skull is, and especially The Walking Dead, is kind of strange. Like, if I had only something like this, small, little folding knife, and I just basically gently shove it into the skull of a zombie. Apparently that works. They seem to be made of jello in that series. Yeah, granted, you may say that, oh well, they're zombies, they're decomposing, they get a little squishy, but the skull, that is still massive bone, and bone doesn't decay all that quickly, so that shouldn't really become all that fragile. And also, the funny thing is, zombies apparently are not all that fragile whenever they have a hold on their prey, because quite often people can't escape from the iron grip of a zombie for some reason, and if they are supposedly so decomposed and squishy and everything, you should be able to just kind of break off their arm or rip it off its socket or whatever and just pry free of the grasp pretty easily. But no, when they've gotten a hold of you, suddenly they become superhuman strength zombies. But yeah, whatever. So the problem is, the brain is quite the large structure, and it has a lot of different areas that are responsible for a variety of different functions that zombies don't really need anymore. Of course, it depends on how you interpret it, how supposedly the zombie moves in the first place, even though being dead, undead. and such, but there are some areas that really shouldn't make any difference if you damage them. Like, especially if you jab something through the eye socket of a zombie. Right behind the eyes is the temporal lobe, and that is responsible, as you may guess, primarily for vision. And that must work differently in zombies anyway, because even if they have completely decomposed eyes, or if carrion birds have just completely eaten their eyes, apparently they can still find you, so they don't seem to be using their eyes. The ones in The Walking Dead theoretically do, but then again, sometimes you have some that have severely damaged eyes and they seem to be doing fine. Well, fine for a zombie. The temporal lobe is also responsible for language, which, again, zombies are not particularly eloquent. Excuse me, sir, would you take offense to me nibbling at your juicy brains? That would be kind of awesome, though. And hearing is also part of its function, which, again, a lot of zombies have severely damaged ear canals anyway, so it's questionable if they actually use that sense. But even if they didn't, I mean, that doesn't kill them. Even if you were to blind and deafen them with an attack like that, with damage to that part of the brain, yeah, once they're near you, they can still kind of feel you or whatever. In any case, they're not dead. And then there is the parietal lobe, which is responsible for comprehension, tactile sensation, language, again, reading. So yeah, tactile sensation may be relevant to an extent, unless again they do it somehow differently. But again, that's not going to drop them dead. And also another part that is very devastating to a living human being if damaged is the brainstem, because it is responsible for basic life functions, heart rate, breathing, things of that nature. So again, zombie doesn't really need that, so it doesn't matter too much. What would probably matter is the back of the head, because that's where the cerebellum is, also called the little brain, and that is responsible for body posture, balance, coordination. And yeah, obviously they do kind of need that, because they are walking around, although clumsily, but that's probably the part that they are using. That's where I guess the virus or whatever it is takes over. So that's probably your best bet, damaging that. But again, just jabbing something into any part of the brain, that's not necessarily going to do the trick. Not that it matters, it's all hypothetical, but if it does, if ever you do run into zombies, I would certainly recommend this.